AEI asked me tonight to specifically address the topic of higher education and where we find it today, where we find it going, and what can and ought we do about that. And so, in other words, when you think about higher education, I'd like to ask the question, who is ed and why is ed high? Believe it or not, we'll come back to that question at the end. Who is ed and why is ed high? So I want to approach it from 3 parts. First, a look at our politics, which is very much my wheelhouse in my profession, my career. And the reason why I want to look at our politics is because the way society conducts itself is a direct reflection on its education. Education and politics are 2 fields that impact all of us, right? You're not going to meet someone who has not been impacted by their education or by our politics. And so how our society engages our politics has a direct correlation to how our society has been educated. From that outward look in, then we'll move to a more introspective perspective, or introspective observation by looking at higher education and academia from within. And so if society's engagement of politics highlights the symptoms, successful or not, of education, then looking within allows us to actually address the issues with higher education and academia. And then lastly, I'll close out by proposing a few solutions that we may consider in pursuing an effort to improve, if not outright save higher education and as a result society. Sound good? Okay. And of course, at the end, I welcome both your questions and conversation. So let's start with politics. As I said, education and politics impacts all of us. How we act as a society is a direct reflection of our education system. And so perhaps the best observation of how our education system is performing is actually a look at how we engage our politics. I've spent the last decade in politics. I've had the privilege of working in both houses of Congress, leading a variety of different campaigns from local level to congressional, to gubernatorial, statewide, presidential races. We've won a lot of races. We have lost a few. None of those were my fault. No, I'm kidding. I kid. I've been in the majority party. I've also been in the minority party. So I've been on both sides of those arguments, those majority-minority arguments. The nature of politics is cyclical. You've all seen that, right? The nature is sometimes Republicans win and sometimes Democrats win. And no matter what the news may tell you, it's never the end of the world. However, there are a few growing trends that I've noticed are not cyclical. They're growing, they're deeply troubling, and they show no signs of slowing down. And so I want to focus on 2 of them. The first is a lack of civility. And I don't think you have to look much further beyond yesterday's headlines or your Twitter feed today to attest to this. In 2016, as we discussed earlier, our firm had the privilege of working with Ohio Governor John Kasich. During that time, a lot of different people from all different political stripes approached me to express how much they appreciated the governor, largely for one reason. He was, quote, the adult in the room. Obviously, this pleased me, right? To have that kind of support made me very, very excited. On the other hand, though, it is not a promising trend that our support for the leader of the free world is decided merely by how he or she behaves. Without addressing any policy issue, people were professing their support for Governor Kasich because he was an adult in the room. Former Representative Jeff Coleman, who's a friend and mentor, addresses this issue of civility in his book, With All Due Respect, Recovering the Manners and Civility of Political Combat. And I believe Jeff recently gave a talk on that book here on this campus. So I sat down with Jeff recently on my show, Face the Issues, shameless plug, sorry. And he explained that while we are quick to place blame at the feet of our politicians, we, as society, also shoulder no small portion of that blame. As he put it, we are, after all, the consumers, and in any business, the producers supply what the consumers demand. So the onus is on us to demand better. So consider the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, a Republican, that we saw last year. And consider the shooting of former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, a Democrat, a few years ago. Neither shooting was perpetrated by a colleague or a staffer from the opposing party or camp. Consider in 2016, a GOP headquarters in North Carolina was blown up in the middle of a campaign. It was Democrat leaders who rallied together to raise money to rebuild it, headed up by a Democrat political strategist named Joe Trippi. So there is blame to go around, and certainly a lot of our politicians shoulder that blame. But we, as the consumers, have to not just demand better, we have to be better. So tied closely to that lack of civility when we look at our politics is also a lack of thought in our discourse. We have largely replaced robust conversations with shouting matches and traded ideas for labels, one-liners, and talking points, something that our conversation thus far has already led us to. So consider the matter of Russia. In 2012, President Obama and his fellow Democrats tore into Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, who was a GOP nominee, for citing Russia as the greatest geopolitical threat. You remember that? 2012? Some of you are too young to remember that, which scares me. President Obama mockingly suggested that Governor Romney hadn't realized the Cold War was over. Later that election cycle, President Obama was caught on an open mic telling Vladimir Putin that he just needed to get through the election and the two could work closer together after that. Not 4 years later, and the tables have turned entirely. Now President Trump touting his relationship with Putin, while Democrats decrying Russia as a geopolitical threat. The conversation on Russia, the capacity of a foreign power to meddle in our elections, and how we should engage with such a foreign entity, today is largely dictated by party lines and partisan talking points. Our inability, or perhaps our absolute refusal to think through these issues, these ideas and these arguments, will allow any issue, whether it's Russia or not, to become a geopolitical threat to our society. So we often hear that elections are a judge of our candidates, the candidates that we produce, right? And certainly there's a truth to that. If you produce a bad candidate, as we've seen in the past, take a look at Pennsylvania's 18th congressional district, the special election. It is a R+10, which means that by turnout standards, Republicans outturned Democrats by a 10% margin. And the Republican candidate that we ran voted against every animal cruelty bill during his tenure in the State House of Representatives. A lot of these he used the sole vote. This is someone who could not raise money, and when asked about it, he said, well, God is on my team, I don't need to raise money. And so you put up a bad candidate, you don't win. That's what happens. And the Democrats won a very historically Republican seat. However, elections and our politics in general are also a judge on our society and on ourselves. So remember, we are the consumers, and our engagement in the political process doesn't merely speak to our candidates, but speaks volumes about us. So we live at two extremes today, and Alex and I were just talking about this before we started tonight. Either we're in a position of absolute political ambivalence, or we're in a place of complete politicization. On the one hand, we all know those who just don't vote, who just don't care, right? People who aren't registered to vote. On the other hand, there are those right now boycotting Taylor Swift because she hasn't revealed who she voted for in the 2016 elections. When you consider that haters gonna hate, she's not wrong. So this is where our shrinking capacity for thought and civility leaves us. Not very long ago, we had robust conversations on ideas. Then eventually, those gave way to debates on whether there were valid ideas to debate. And today, that has given way to conversations about how to talk to each other. And that's where our politics stands now. And you look at Governor Kasich, or you look at Representative Coleman's book, and the large push among the, quote, governing wing in whatever political party is that we have to return to being able to talk to each other. This is a far cry from any conversation on actual policy matters that affect you and affect me. So that's where our politics leaves us today. It's not a very sunny outlook. So while that survey of today's politics reveals certainly problematic issues with our society, these are still largely symptoms. This is still not a root problem or a root cause. These are still largely symptoms. And so if we turn our attention to a more introspective look at higher education and academia, we're going to see two primary concerns I'd like to highlight this evening. The first is thought, picking up right where we left off with our political conversation. Our decreasing capacity to think is not a political problem, but an educational one. One that I believe has been exacerbated by the permeation of postmodern relativism in academia and in society. So I wrote a paper a few years ago on postmodern relativism and how it's hijacked our politics and our education system. And specifically, I focus on the question of tolerance. Right? So you're in college, you've all heard people telling you to be tolerant. Right? Tolerance is in so many ways taken over our campuses all over the country. Yet, what is tolerance? So the term is thrown around loosely in modern society in a manner that implies acceptance. It's a basic assumption that all beliefs hold equal truth and a subsequent unfettered acceptance of all and any views. So that's the kind of the way tolerance is put out there, right? Think about it. Think about what you've encountered, whether here on campus or with your friends or in society. We push tolerance as a absolute, unfettered acceptance of all and any views. This, however, cannot be further from the truth. So consider this. Tolerance can only exist in disagreement. It is not directed toward beliefs or viewpoints, but toward people. When two individuals disagree on a particular matter, tolerance does not call for a consensus on the matter. To be tolerant is not for one individual to agree, let alone act in accordance with the other's belief. Should dialogue reach that point, it's no longer tolerance, but conversion, or more pessimistically, equivocation. Rather, tolerance calls to be agreeable toward the person while disagreeing, however fiercely, with his or her belief. Contrary to what is relentlessly peddled, tolerance is not remotely represented by the phrase, "what's true for you may not be true for me." Instead, it is exemplified by the old adage, "I may disagree with what you say, but will defend your right to say it." So as a result, the effect of tolerance is robust dialogue and the meaningful exchange of ideas, not the demands for capitulation and elementary name-calling to which discourse so often denigrates in society today. The latter, instead, is a direct result of the hijacking of tolerance, something much more akin to coercion than to tolerance. It is done to shut down instead of open debate, to narrow instead of broaden horizons, and to shallow instead of deepen understanding. Where tolerance demands both critical thinking and human civility, its hijacking has dismissed both. Consider that for a moment versus what we are often sold as tolerance on college campuses. So several years ago, my associate, Kate Hardiman, and I were discussing this very issue over dinner in Washington. And at that time, the Oberfeld v. Hodges case, the same-sex marriage case, was being argued before the Supreme Court. And Kate remarked to me that once the same-sex marriage debate was legally settled, the next great, quote, civil rights debate would move toward the classroom. It would not be a debate on any particular issue, but on a framework. And most importantly, it would not be a debate that we could lose. So a quick look at our campuses validates Hardiman's astute observation from several years ago. So for example, thinking about what we just said about tolerance, consider the presence of safe spaces in our campuses today. Is this prevalent at Messiah? Safe spaces? No? Not as much? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it, you think it is? Okay. How is a safe space safe when those holding particular viewpoints are banned from voicing those views or concerns? Rather, a true safe space is a space in which everyone and anyone is welcome to express their views and engage in conversation or even debate on those views. A true safe space fosters true tolerance. What we often call safe spaces today are fostering this hijacking of tolerance that I addressed in that essay. Now consider this, the very idea of the university was to foster these conversations. And if we cannot have these conversations on the university campus, then where can we?
They are a little bit more like not like it is. I don't know what you guys think. Do you think that you're taking care of the people you disagree? You think I'm gonna do something?
depends on the topic.
Yeah.
And that leads to an interesting thought of, are people, when you think about tolerance, think about open-mindedness, right? And are people actually more open-minded than others, or are we simply open-minded on different ideas? There's a big difference between those who often accuse you of being closed-minded are usually just as closed-minded as you are. There's on different issues. That's the only difference. The interesting thing when you consider this issue with tolerance, with postmodern relativism, and how it's permeated our education system and our thought system, is Flannery O'Connor actually addresses this long before safe spaces became a thing. And she wrote, "Those who have no absolute values cannot let the relative remain merely relative. They are always raising it to the level of the absolute." So even your most pure relativist is an absolutist in some way, shape, or form. And so, like we just said, it's not a question of whether someone is more open-minded than someone else. It is a question over on what issues are we open-minded, or closed-minded, or tolerant. Because even those who claim to be relative are always raising the relative to the level of the absolute. My graduate school advisor, who I mentioned to you earlier and tortured me during my thesis defense, is a gentleman named Francis Beckwith, who's a well-renowned legal scholar and moral philosopher, and he tells a story of when his younger sister was attending school, as she attended a Catholic school in Las Vegas. So there's your setting for you. And for those of you who follow comedy, his younger sister is the comedian Elizabeth Beckwith. And she was in school, and the first day, the teacher started off class by explaining to them that nobody has the answers to anything. And therefore, the class policy would be that everyone has to listen to everyone else. So she goes home and has this conversation with her brother, and the next day she returns, and she asks the teacher, if nobody has the answers to anything, then why should I listen to anybody? It's a fair question. And that's exactly where postmodern relativism leaves us. It leaves us with a warm, fuzzy feeling that we're being tolerant, when in reality, something is rising to the level of the absolute, and everything else is being coerced around it. And the result is an absolute lack of critical thinking. So when we shatter the notion of absolutes, we subsequently shatter any meaningful dialogue, and we shatter any meaning in our pursuits. So as society has largely forgotten, so as a result, not only have we largely shrinked and reduced our capacity to think, we've also largely forgotten to see the person through the cloud of partisan politics. Higher education and academia have similarly lost sight of that person. So just like we talked about in our politics, how we are starting to lose sight of civility, and that our great conversation in politics today focuses on how to talk to each other. That same problem is happening in academia and in higher education. So dominating the debate in higher education is the age-old question of whether education is an end in and of itself, or is a means to an end, namely a successful career and the perks that come with it, be it wealth, fame, power, and the like. On the one side sits academia and the concept of a liberal arts education, which is what you're receiving here at Messiah. On the other sits an increased push for vocational education, and even within the realms of academia, a market-driven education. Major in what is marketable, right? Major in what pays the bills. Philosophy is great, but it doesn't pay the bills. But you should totally major in philosophy. That's a side plug. However, are the two sides of this debate perhaps more similar than they're letting on? Specifically, has liberal education become merely one of many volumes in the market-driven education model? Let me give you an example. I'm a proud alumnus of Baylor University, where we boast one of the nation's most interdisciplinary core curriculums. as determined in study after study from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. In fact, one of our honors programs has the tagline, "Life is interdisciplinary, your education should be too." So while we are told that such a well-rounded liberal education is for the benefit of the student, toward what end is that benefit? Do we not boast in that achievement to attract students to the university? And do students not boast in that distinction to give themselves an advantage in the job market? I, for one, definitely did. So perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps the question is not whether education is an end or a means, but for what end is it a means? In other words, what is the ultimate goal of your education? With the shattering of absolutes in today's higher education society, it is no wonder that we view the ultimate goal of education to be a successful career. But let me propose to you today that the ultimate goal of education is you, the student, not your career. Your development as a person, as a thinker, and as a leader is the purpose of higher education. It is, or at least it should be, why Messiah College exists, and it should be why you're here. Achieve this, and where you go is entirely up to you. The decisions are limitless. Continue the trend of education as an ATM, which I might add is a very pricey one, and you become nothing more than a puppet of the market. So it's no secret that if our education system has lost sight of thought and of the person, that our politics would too. Nearly 500 years ago, philosopher René Descartes famously embarked on the journey where he assumed nothing and questioned everything. Anyone here study Descartes? Kind of? Okay.
Yeah, one thing.
Okay. So he goes on this journey. He says, let's question everything. And his first conclusions were simple, that we as persons exist and are thinking things. The rest of reality rests upon these truths. So decades and centuries of educational research, reform, and supposed improvements later, we're still fighting for these two basic principles, that we exist as persons and we are created to think. It's kind of depressing when you think that 500 years later, we're still arguing about these principles. So where do we go from here? It's always easier to criticize the system than improve upon it. And as someone that's in politics, I promise you that's true. It's a lot easier to criticize the person in office than to be there and have to make those votes yourself. So I refuse to do the former without at least offering some ideas toward the latter. So I'm going to close by offering you a few different ideas. The first is an idea for our education system as a whole, and it actually came out of a conversation with my associate, Kate Hardiman, so I can't take credit for this one. Debate is something that we teach in college, maybe in high school. Any of you take a debate class or debate on your team? No. In high school? Was it high school? College?
I did the mock trial.
Mock trial, okay. And it was a elective, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's something that we teach in college, maybe high school, but generally as an elective. Perhaps we need to be teaching debate at an earlier age. Consider this, that debate is not merely the practice of arguing. If it were, we'd just recommend getting married earlier. But it's an intricate process that begins with research, progresses to viewpoint development, then the articulation of an argument, and finally the rebuttal of an argument. Debate's a process that impacts how we think on a variety of matters, and the skills that we achieve in learning debate will actually change how we learn and will change how we process in other coursework. At its core, if done right, it allows us to see ideas instead of labels and to make arguments instead of catchphrases. So personalizing that idea of debate is how you and I engage in it. So as John Locke astutely observed, we are all good judges of all matters except those matters that deal with ourselves. So this is why government agents are warned to never become personally involved in the case. This is also why you might be great at giving good relationship advice to your friends, but somehow manage to screw up your own relationships. Like I said, we could just get married earlier, we'll learn the art of arguing. This is also how we think, and it's the reason that I always tell my students to think with your heads and feel with your hearts and don't do it the other way. It's not the other way around. Think with your head, feel with your heart. So how do we do that? One simple tactic is to remove the argument in any debate from the debate's surrounding context. This is not a call to take someone else's words out of context. Rather, doing so allows us to formulate an argument in a non-controversial setting where it is largely unaffected by our emotions. So let me give you an example. Next time you're arguing about immigration, abortion, taxes, etc., take the argument that you're making out and apply it to a topic like sports, cooking, or the interstate commerce of cabbages. By taking a step back, you're allowing yourself to see people as people, ideas as ideas, and arguments as arguments. We all know that there are bad arguments for good ideas or good arguments for bad ideas, or good people with bad ideas and bad people with good ideas. Our goal in dialogue and debate must be to shed light and not heat on those issues. So taking that step back allows you to do just that. Fundamentally, we must understand that knowledge is not understanding, is not wisdom. And so these first 2 points, the idea that we would benefit in our education system by teaching debate at an earlier age, and the idea that in our debates, we would benefit from stepping back out of the context of emotion. These first 2 points highlight both knowledge and understanding, allowing us to see both clearly. And so I want to leave you then with this thought on wisdom. There are 3 major parts of your life. There are a lot of parts of your life, but there are 3 major parts of your life. There's who you are, right? So if we picture it, there's who you are, there's who you know, and there's what you do, right? In your life, up to this point, has been hyper-focused on who you know and what you do. And for the rest of your life, that is going to be the driving force of everything that you do, everything you're involved in. So just think back to when you're in middle school. And it's been about who do you know, who do you know, who do you know? Who writes your recommendations? Who are your friends, right? What clique are you in? Are you a jock? Are you a band geek? Are you a nerd? Who writes your recommendations for college? Who do you take to prom, right? Now think about when you're in college. Who writes your recommendations for your job? Who are your references? Who are you dating? Who are you going to marry? It's about who do you know, who do you know, who do you know? And then it's about what do you do? Again, think all the way back to the time that you're in middle school. What sports do you play? What activities are you a part of? Through college, right? Do you need to take the GREs? Do you need to take the GMATs or the MCATs? It's all about what do you do, what do you do, what do you do? When you go into the workforce, it's going to be the exact same thing. Who do you know? What connections are you making? What networking event are you going to? Not just who do you know, but who knows you? And then what do you have to do to get ahead? Where's the next promotion? Where's the next job? Where's the next income level? Your lives are hyper-focused on those last 2 chairs. And think about everything we've just discussed politically and with education. It makes sense why we are hyper-focused on those last 2, what I call chairs, but those last 2 sections of our lives. But I would propose to you today that it's backward. That who you know and what you do will never make you who you are. But rather who you are on the inside, you at your core, your passions, will dictate the significance of every relationship that you have and the success of everything that you do. And that is why the university's focus must be the person. Your education is toward an end, and that end is you and your development. That end is finding you and your passions, because that will dictate everything else. Your doing will always flow from your being, not the other way around. And if you need proof of that, just think about people like Mark Sanford, the former governor of South Carolina, member of Congress, who was one step away from becoming the vice president of the United States, and threw it all away because he told do you guys remember the Mark Sanford story? I'm getting blank stares. So he's the governor of South Carolina, tells the press he's hiking the Appalachian Trail. They find out he's actually in Argentina having an affair on the taxpayer dollar. Think about John Edwards, the former senator from North Carolina, who's vice presidential nominee, right? John Kerry's vice presidential nominee, who we find out has fathered an illegitimate child while his wife was dying of cancer. Think about Tiger Woods, right? There are endless numbers of TV personalities, of businessmen, of athletes, of politicians, even of ministers, who you would say, if I was married to that person, I would never cheat on them. If I had that job or that was on the line, I would never cheat on my taxes. I would never do something that stupid. And I would propose to you that each of those were failed by a system that fundamentally believed you could earn your identity by the people you know and the things that you do. It is something that is fed to us in politics, and it's something that's being fed to you in education. And so my parting advice is find who you are. That is why you're here, to find who you are, to develop that, find those passions, because that's what's ultimately going to determine your success and determine the significance of your relationships. But none of that happens if we don't first understand that absolutes exist and they order our surroundings. And if we reject this, as postmodern relativism does, then none of what I've said matters, and sadly, none of your education matters either. So I will stop there, and I would be happy to take any questions, or even better, engage in conversation. Thank you.